The air in Whitechapel was thick with dread as September drew to a close. The autumn of terror had gripped the city, and the fear was palpable. Despite my relentless pursuit, Jack the Ripper remained elusive, a ghost in the fog. But I, Detective Edward Mitchell, was more determined than ever to bring this monster to justice. The night of September 30th, 1888, would forever be etched in infamy as the double event. It began like any other, with the streets shrouded in an eerie silence. I had been patrolling the alleys, my senses heightened, knowing that the Ripper could strike again at any moment. Little did I know, this night would bring twice the horror. The first victim was Elizabeth Stride, known as Long Liz. She was found in Dutfield's yard. I stumbled upon the scene just after 1 a.m. The sight that greeted me was one of grim finality. Elizabeth lay on the ground, her throat cut deeply. Blood pooled around her, but unlike the previous victims, her abdomen was untouched. It was as if the killer had been interrupted. As I knelt beside her, I noticed the signs of a struggle. Her hands clutched at her shawl, and there were fresh bruises on her face. My mind raced. Had someone seen the Ripper? Had he been scared off before he could complete his gruesome ritual? The thought offered a small glimmer of hope amidst the horror. I questioned the few witnesses in the area, their accounts varying in detail but consistent in one respect. They had seen a man fleeing the scene. The descriptions were frustratingly vague, a man of medium height, dressed in dark clothing. It was a pattern I had grown all too familiar with. Barely an hour had passed when the second horror unfolded. The bells of the nearby church tolled 2 a.m. as a scream shattered the silence. I ran towards Mitre Square, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. There, under the weak glow of a gas lamp, lay Catherine Eddowes. Catherine's mutilated body was a sight of unimaginable brutality. Her throat had been slashed and her abdomen was savagely torn open. Her intestines were pulled out and placed over her shoulder. The Ripper had carved her face, leaving grotesque marks that seemed to mock us all. It was clear that this time, he had not been interrupted. The scene was chaotic, with constables and onlookers gathering, their faces masks of horror and disbelief. I felt a wave of despair wash over me. 2 murders in one night, and I had been powerless to stop either. The Ripper was taunting us, showing his ability to strike with impunity. Back at my flat, I spread out the reports, the flickering candle casting long shadows on the walls. The double event presented a new level of savagery and audacity. Elizabeth Stride's interrupted murder suggested the Ripper was feeling pressured, but Catherine Eddowes' mutilation showed he was far from being deterred. He was escalating, becoming more brutal, more fearless. I pored over the details, searching for any clue, any pattern that might have been overlooked. The letters we had received, purportedly from the Ripper himself, taunted me. They were filled with gruesome details and signed with a chilling moniker, "From Hell." Were they genuine, or the work of a twisted mind seeking attention? The nights grew colder, and the fog thicker as October began. I felt the weight of the investigation pressing down on me, the sleepless nights and constant fear taking their toll. But I could not falter. The people of Whitechapel were depending on me. The faces of the victims haunted my dreams, driving me to push harder, dig deeper. One evening I received a tip from an informant who claimed to have seen a man matching the Ripper's description near a boarding house on Flower and Dean Street. I followed the lead, my heart pounding with anticipation. The boarding house was a decrepit building, its walls stained with years of neglect. As I approached, I could feel the eyes of its inhabitants on me, wary and distrustful. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and decay. I questioned the landlord, a surly man who seemed more interested in his bottle of gin than in cooperating with the police. He grudgingly pointed me to a room at the end of a narrow hallway. I knocked on the door, my hand hovering near my revolver. The door creaked open to reveal a man who fit the description: medium height, dark clothing, a shadow of madness in his eyes. My heart raced. Could this be him? Could this be the monster I had been hunting? I questioned him, my voice steady but my mind racing. His answers were evasive, his demeanor unsettling. He claimed to know nothing of the murders, but there was a glint in his eye, a flicker of something dark and dangerous. I left the boarding house with more questions than answers, my suspicion gnawing at me. The days turned into weeks and the pressure mounted. The double event had shaken the community to its core, and the fear was palpable. The newspapers were relentless, their headlines screaming of the Ripper's latest atrocities. The public demanded answers, and I felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. One night, as I walked the fog-laden streets, I encountered a woman named Mary Jane Kelly. She was a striking figure, her red hair a beacon in the gloom. She spoke to me with a mix of defiance and fear, her eyes reflecting the harsh realities of life in Whitechapel. She had heard of the Ripper, of course, and she was scared, but she refused to let the fear control her. Our conversation lingered in my mind as I continued my patrol. Mary Jane Kelly was different from the other women I had met. There was a strength in her, a resilience that stood out amidst the despair. I made a mental note to keep an eye on her to ensure she stayed safe. As October drew to a close, the tension in Whitechapel reached a boiling point. The Ripper's reign of terror had to end, but the question remained: how? The clues were sparse, the witnesses unreliable, and the killer seemed always one step ahead. I returned to Mitre Square, retracing my steps from that fateful night. The scene replayed in my mind: the horror of Catherine Eddowes' mutilation, the chaos, the despair. I stood there, alone in the fog, and made a silent vow. I would not rest. I would not falter. I would bring Jack the Ripper to justice. The hunt continued, and the nights grew longer. Each new dawn was a reminder of the lives lost, the terror inflicted. But I was driven by a fierce determination, a burning need to stop the monster who had brought such darkness to Whitechapel. The days bled into nights, and each new morning was a cruel reminder of the horror that gripped Whitechapel. The fear in the community had reached a fever pitch. The streets, once bustling with activity, were now eerily quiet. Doors that were once open to the world were now bolted shut, and the few who dared to venture out did so with hurried steps and wary eyes. The press had dubbed this period the Autumn of Terror, a fitting moniker for the wave of fear and dread that washed over the city. Every corner of Whitechapel seemed to whisper of the Ripper's presence. The tension was palpable, a living entity that seemed to press down on everyone. In the midst of this, I found solace in my solitary pursuit. My superiors were none the wiser about my off-duty investigations. They saw me as a dedicated detective, diligent in my work. They had no idea of the sleepless nights, the relentless pursuit, the obsession that drove me. One evening, as I made my way through a particularly dark alley, I overheard a conversation that piqued my interest. Two men were speaking in hushed tones, their faces partially hidden by the shadows. They spoke of a man who had been seen lurking near the scenes of the murders, a man who fit the vague descriptions we had gathered. I approached them cautiously, my badge hidden, my demeanor casual. I asked them to recount what they had seen, and they spoke of a tall man, dressed in dark clothing, who moved with an unsettling grace. They mentioned his eyes, cold, calculating, and filled with a strange, disturbing light. Their account matched the fragmented descriptions I had collected. It was another piece of the puzzle, another thread to follow. I thanked them and continued my patrol, my mind racing with possibilities. As the days passed, I began to notice a pattern in the Ripper's movements. He struck in the early hours of the morning, when the fog was thickest and the streets were at their quietest. He targeted women who were alone, vulnerable, and unsuspecting. His attacks were swift, brutal, and meticulously planned. I decided to focus my efforts on these early morning hours, patrolling the streets with heightened vigilance. I spoke with the night workers, the vendors setting up their stalls, the early risers who had no choice but to navigate the treacherous streets. Their accounts were invaluable, providing insights that helped me narrow down the Ripper's hunting grounds. One particularly foggy morning, I found myself in Dorset Street, a place known for its squalor and vice. As I walked the narrow alleyways, I heard a muffled cry. My heart raced, and I quickened my pace, the fog swallowing the sound almost as soon as it reached my ears. I turned a corner and saw a figure disappearing into the mist. I followed, my senses on high alert. The alley was a maze of twists and turns, the fog playing tricks on my vision. But I pressed on, driven by the desperate need to catch the Ripper. Finally, I emerged into a small courtyard. The figure was gone, but in the center of the courtyard lay another body. My heart sank as I approached. recognizing the familiar signs of the Ripper's handiwork. The woman had been brutally slain, her body a testament to the killer's unrelenting savagery. I knelt beside her, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and sorrow. The Ripper had struck again, and I had been so close. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow, but it only strengthened my resolve. As I stood in that courtyard, the fog closing in around me, I made another vow. I would not stop. I would not rest. The Ripper's reign of terror would end, and I would be the one to bring him to justice. The hunt continued, and I was more determined than ever. With a final lingering look at the tragic scene, I turned and walked back into the fog, my steps resolute. The autumn of terror was far from over, but I was ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead. The Ripper's days were numbered, and I would see to it that he was brought to justice. By my hand it would end. As the final days of autumn approached, I knew the Ripper's next move could come at any moment. I was prepared, vigilant, and determined to catch him. The patterns, the clues, the whispers all led to one inevitable conclusion. The hunt was not over. It was just beginning. The night of November 9th, 1888 was looming. I sensed it would bring more bloodshed, but this time I vowed to be there, to stop him, to end this reign of terror once and for all.